Can you talk a little bit about like what are these Reformation truths? Like, what is the Protestant Reformation all about?
Yeah,
What's like the beauty? You talk about the beauty of the Reformation and reading
yeah,
the Reformers. How is it different than like the Catholic Church and
right.
things like this in your view?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that for a lot of Protestants, they think church history began in 1517 with Martin Luther. And that's simply not true. The Reformation has been an ongoing process that has been going throughout church history, and it reached its peak in 1517 with Luther's nailing the 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, Germany. But before Luther, it's important to realize that there were reformers before Luther. It's just that many of them ended up dead. Some of them were run out of town. Luther was greatly protected by the princes of Germany, and he was able to do what a lot of others were not able to do. So what you find is, I refer to these as the three P's, Zach: the primacy of Christ, the priority of Scripture, and the purity of the gospel. And when we look at these reformers, Luther and before, I'm talking about going all the way back to Augustine in the 5th century, and even before that into some of the church fathers like Diognetus and Clement of Rome. And what you find is that these fellows were teaching the same thing, that Christ was to be supreme, preeminent in all things, Christ alone. And then the importance of the scriptures as the voice of God, the priority of scripture over all things. Some of the famous apologists like Athanasius and others appealed to the supremacy of the scriptures in refuting the heretics. And also the purity of the gospel, this beautiful revelation that God saves sinners by his grace alone without their works that they could not merit. And so in Roman Catholicism, of course, and that's what these reformers were challenging was, number one, what is the ultimate authority in the church? Rome said it was the Pope. And these reformers said, but the scripture doesn't say that. The scripture says that Christ is the head of his church, Christ is king, and Christ is to be preeminent over all things. And then when it came to the question of how can a man be made right with God? Well, Rome said he needed the sacraments, he had to go through various meritorious works. And the reformers looked at the gospel and they said, well, wait a minute, the gospel says that it is by grace that we have been saved through faith, and not that of ourselves. It is the gift of God. And so the Reformation for me, Zach, the reformers were not innovators. They didn't come along and just invent some new brand of Christianity. What they did was they recovered the gospel purity, the primacy of Christ. And they admitted openly, we're not making up anything new here. They weren't trying to start a new denomination or denominations. They wanted to go back, and one of the terms that they used was in Latin was ad fontes, and ad fontes means back to the source, back to the fountains. And what they meant by that was back to the scriptures. And so when they went back to the scriptures and only the scriptures, they found that the gospel that Augustine preached, the gospel that the church fathers were talking about, like Athanasius, what the Waldensians were preaching back in the 12th century, and then Jan Hus in Bohemia in the 14th century, up all the way through Wycliffe and then Tyndale and so forth, was the same gospel. It was the same gospel that the apostles were preaching. And so that's why I find these reformational doctrines, the five solas of the Reformation, are so central because they're God glorifying. They focus on Christ, and it ends with soli Deo gloria, that it is to the glory of God alone, not man's glory, but God's glory alone.